To understand our rocky relationship, you have to go back to World War II when it was just Korea and part of the Japanese Empire. After the war, the Korean peninsula was divided in half. The Communist Soviets to the north and the United States occupied the south. But after years of border skirmishes, in 1950, dictator Kim Il-sung invaded the south with 75,000 soldiers. This was the first military act of the Cold War. The U.S. got involved to stop the spread of communism, a.k.a. the Korean War, but it didn't go so well. After 3 years and about 5 million deaths, the North and South signed a truce, an agreement the North has threatened to break several times, an agreement that didn't end the war. In fact, technically, that war never ended. So who runs the show? The Kim family. First Kim Il-sung, then his son Kim Jong-il, and now his son Kim Jong-un. Under these guys, life has been hard. North Korea is accused of having the worst human rights in the world, where people are managed by the state from jobs to travel to fashion. Amnesty International reports concentration camps, torture, and executions. Now, as far as America's relationship with the country, after 1953, things were pretty quiet. Until the 80s, when North Korea built its first nuclear power plant, they said for peaceful purposes, but the U.S. didn't buy it. And we were right. Their goal? To develop nuclear weapons. And they did. This started a roller coaster of sanctions, broken promises, and more weapons. Lots of them, including long-range missiles capable of hitting the U.S.